Hi, it's Mel with Forensics. I wanted to go into and add a little bit more context to a recent post, which is sector seasonality. And I'm sure this is something you'll hear several times throughout the year, and of course, right now, because of weaker seasonality coming up into September. You are seeing a lot of posts about it, you're hearing about it on CNBC. But really, let's take a deeper look because while you may have some areas of the market that are weaker during September, there are actually some great opportunities setting up into some other sectors that many are probably not looking at. And of course, Qs, you've got the Qs, and I think that's the bigger thing that people are looking at, those big mega cap tech names. And seasonality does fall off a bit in September. But first off, let me kind of backtrack and give you more insight on kind of how I built this chart out or what I'm looking at. And ultimately, it's the percentage of months in the last 10 years, and giving you that percentage on that individual ETF and how it's performed. And so in August, you can see this first column. I like to be able to have that as a reference. Where were we and where are we going is kind of important because then that's really where you can see where there's the potential for some rotation or where you may need to be a little cautious, especially if you start to see weakening seasonality. So I kind of laid it out to where, we were weak in August, but we're going to see some strength in September. And I'm using kind of a 20-point basis as either an increase or decrease for that. So yes, the SMH does jump, 10% August to September, but I'm looking for kind of those bigger areas. What could we expect to see based off of historical seasonality really wane off versus, what could be an area where we could see some sector rotation. So starting with the Qs, of course, this is what everybody's talking about. In August, in the last 10 years, 70% of the time you've had outperformance and then you drop to 30% of the time. And this is going to be relative to SPY, just to kind of give us a benchmark, something to base it off of. Only 30% of the time has it outperformed. So, of course, that's a lot of what people are concerned about or discussing, but it doesn't mean that there isn't those areas of the market that we can still see sector rotation. And that's the beauty of trading, is being able to spot that, find where you have that trend. A rising tide lifts all boats. So if you can kind of start to see and also be able to check off those boxes, right? Like this is just looking at probabilities. I do trade money flow. So when I have an outlook or a benchmark or just data that I could look at, especially using seasonality, now I'm a little bit more heightened. I'm a lot more aware, and I want to be able to use this XLF here. So we've got XLF being one of those that really hasn't done much at all. So for August, only outperformed SPY in the last 10 years 40% of the time. But look at this jump. You go from 40 to 70. That's a bigger increase. And it really doesn't stop there. You're just kind of getting started to where if you look through the other months, you've got October being the strongest month for the last 10 years for the XLF. And then also continued strength into November before you start to drop off a little bit. And so that's kind of going to be what I look at. I'm going to show some examples and a few other things that I look at. But just because you have weakness or what everybody's quote, quote, saying weak doesn't mean that there's areas that aren't able to actually outperform. And love being able to find those rotational trades, especially being able to see that come through dark pool wise and what we have in flow. It just creates that heightened awareness for me. And so how did I build this? What am I looking at? I do use stock charts. Unfortunately, this is not a feature available for free, but it is definitely one that I love. So what am I looking at here? So seasonality, and this is what I did pretty much to build this whole the whole spreadsheet. I went through and just put a ticker relative to SPY, and I think 5 years gives you some insight, but I wanted to be able to have a little bit more time. I think that's where you find some balance. 10 years was the sweet spot for me. I realized that not every ETF has been trading for 20 years, so didn't want to be able to have some data skewed to where some was 20-year historical, others were 5, others were 10, and I think 10 was just kind of, like I said, the sweet spot. But while we're here, XLF comparative to SPY, you can just see from the data um, the strength, where you go August into September and October from a 5-year perspective. Now let's jump over to that 10-year mark. Oh, it's not letting me do that. So let me just try to fix this. Yeah. Okay. So here we go. So 10 years. And something that's catching my eye just right off the bat, and I'm sure you're just looking how flatline March to August. Interestingly enough, we had that pullback and that whole mess with all the banks, but you've just been so flat. And so it's been hard to even look at, where you could expect some upside, or maybe some people thought there was going to be this like really quick reflective trade, or this just like bottom that came in and you'd have this very sharp V reversal. But historically speaking, you just don't really see that for the XLF. But if you look at September, October, November, this is where you have that clustering. You have this opportunity to where this sector has historically really set up and outperformed. And so what does that mean? Like, does that mean that's going to happen? No. I mean, history repeats itself or rhymes, whatever the saying is. But it gives you that chance to be able to go and look at your charts, set up alerts. For me, I like to watch flow, dark pool. I'm looking at what's coming in, and now I'm a little bit more heightened into what may come in because I feel like I'm already prepared and know that there may be a rotational trade. Of course, it may be. I'm not positioning myself long just because I see seasonality. I just want to at least be aware. And of course, now when I see some flow come into FAS, which is a 3 times leverage long financial, so I'm a little bit more, it catches my eye more. If I see dark pool activity in the XLF, which we have, so I'll go over that in just a few, it just kind of helps to build that story. So this is where the information came from. I just manually went through, checked every sector, and put it into a table just so that we kind of have a summary. So another resource is Equity Clock. They have been around for years. This is all they do is seasonality, because seasonality, believe it or not, is a bigger thing, and a lot of what most of the desks trade off of, or at least are looking at. Um, Worth checking out. And so this is the free site. When you go to Equity Clock, one of the things that you're going to see is just a very quick, easy to read snapshot. I mean, just right here, major indices, sectors, industrials. Look at this. It's worth paying attention to, at least to just make sure you're not fighting where you have had historically good or bad performance. So just, even starting there. Sectors, you could see financials just kind of dull in between there, but um, just areas of where you know that historically there's been that strength or either that weakness. And then they even break it down and go a step further into the industries, which I think is really neat. Take a look at, what was it that caught my eye earlier? Agriculture, this first one, you have that strength that starts to come in, and you also have commodities. So this is kind of what it looks like as far as having at least a free look. I have an account here, so I don't know the extent of what you can see or can't see, but going to just show what we have from the XLF, because they do show a little bit of a better chart so that you can see that it's just not a whole month. Of course, the month just doesn't, you just don't start the first of the month and you just constantly go up. And if you look here in the end of August into September, you can see that the beginning of the month is when you start to see the relative performance, but also at the end is where you start to see a little bit of a pullback before you go back up. And so this can break it down, and kind of what I like to do is think of it as weeks, like trading weeks. So early into the month, stronger at the end, kind of could expect to see a pullback. Now, this is just taking the XLF in and of itself. There's also a relative screenshot that's going to take it to the SPY, which is kind of what I was running my numbers on. And you can see that you have that larger increase at the end of August into September, and then you have that pullback. And XLF, of course, is a basket of stocks. So, to be honest, XLF kind of has that smaller average true range. It's not one of those ETFs that you could really get that, really large leverage. One thing, it's liquid, but as far as average true range, it's not one of those that are going to move. And so it's worth knowing the components that make up the XLF, and especially if you have anything that's maybe heavily weighted, just so that you can look at those names or at least be familiar, because if you start to see flow or dark pool or your technical setup, those may be the names, especially if you trade options, that will give you more of that move because they're going to move differently than the XLF. It's kind of a sleeper. So bar chart is a great resource. They also have a lot of free data. But one of the things that I like the most is when you search in a ticker, you get this like great overview, whatever, but keep scrolling down and they have the top 10 holdings off to the right. So if you're doing some ETF research or trying to find out what is in a holding, you can see the exact percentages. Click that and you can see the whole makeup, and actually even download it, which is kind of cool because if you use TradingView as your charting platform and you wanted to be able to keep up with that and maybe start a chart list, you can download those stickers, then I'm sure easily upload them, whether it's TOS, whatever the case is. But I think more importantly, just making sure that you're aware of where there are larger holdings. And of course, Berkshire being one of the largest, but then you've got JPM, and now you have more weighting into Visa and MasterCard. And of course, you can see, where the banks are. So a few kind of, it's still not bad as far as evenly weighted. But definitely worth knowing, what you have, what makes up that ETF, and then going from there. Because of course, not every ETF is very evenly weighted. So the XLF, you've got Berkshire, JPM, Visa, KBE is another ETF. It's the S&P Bank ETF. We've been seeing some dark pool activity here. So before I go there, just to kind of give you a look here, it was so evenly weighted, like everybody gets the same piece of the pie. It's just very much across the board. So while it's nice to see dark pool activity there or some flow, you're really only kind of covering the basket, which is okay, but just you don't have anything that is predominant. And kind of what I mean, just while we're here, is I'll show you XLE. If I see flow in XLE extremely liquid, but one of the things that I think is really important to note is how unbalanced, in a sense of what makes up or will move that ETF. So XOM has 21% and then CVX has 18%. So you look at two heavy hitters here, that you could choose to trade opposed to just trading maybe a slower moving ETF. Of course, that's going to kind of come down to, are you trading commons or options? Are you shorter dated? What are you looking at? But worth mentioning, bar chart definitely is a great resource as well, especially being able to deep dive. I did reach out to a representative there last night. Wanted to make sure that their data was, how often they updated. They said at least once a month. So you are getting the most up-to-date information from a sector perspective. So I appreciate that representative getting back to me. So, that's just kind of a breakdown and kind of how I like to rabbit hole. And of course, I do look at not only options flow, but dark pool activity. So did want to jump over to the BlackBox site because we've seen some pretty large options